Hello everyone, welcome back to a rather wet episode of Project Civic Si. Today I'm going to be installing the TSX OEM Big Brake Kit upgrade. Now, in order to preface this episode, I want to take our time machine and go all the way back to the year 2016. I was a much younger man back then, virile, strong. I also thought, instead of taking my very fast BMW track car to the racetrack, I would take my then bone stock daily driver to the track instead. I figured it'd be fun to see kind of how this car did on the racetrack, so I really had no idea back then. And initially, everything was great. I was at Buttonwillow Raceway Park and the car was tons of fun. It felt pretty quick and lively on its toes. The engine was good, the transmission was good, the handling was good, and the brakes were there. And then a few more laps in, and then all of a sudden the brake pedal felt kind of funny, and the next lap I lost all brakes together. I had to engine brake the car to a stop and then coast into the paddock and see what had happened. Turns out it's an all too common problem with this platform is that the front brake rotors had completely overheated. Basically, although I wasn't running a very aggressive brake pad, the back-to-back constant lapping with the small stock brakes was enough to completely overheat the front rotors until they were grooved as deeply as a record. As you can imagine, when rotors are grooved that deeply, there's no real area for the pad to touch the rotor anymore, and thus you don't really stop that well. So, fast forward 3 years later, 2019, where I started to really track this car quite seriously. And you may notice from the first couple videos, the common talking points with this car are definitely two things. The shocks, they're blown, and the brakes. I've been taking a lot of cool down laps in between, kind of letting the brakes cool off. And even still, I'm still fighting fade, bad brake feel, inconsistency, and it's kind of a mess. And for a track car, brakes are a safety item first and foremost. So I need to address it, and today I am with the OEM TSX brake upgrade. Now, the first generation Acura TSX, 2004 to 2008, I believe actually uses the same front knuckle design as the 8th generation Civic, and so the front brakes are actually plug and play on this car. Now, at first glance, if you look at the spec sheet, you'd be wondering what's the difference, how is it an upgrade? Indeed, it's true that both the Acura TSX and Civic Si have front rotors that are 300 millimeters in diameter. However, when you turn the wheel and look at the rotors head on, you can see that the TSX rotors are much thicker. Civic Si rotors are 25 millimeters in thickness, while the TSX brakes are 28 millimeters in thickness. And you'd be saying to yourself, 3 millimeters, what's the big deal? And indeed, if it was diameter, that would be nothing. But in terms of rotor thickness, 3 millimeters in terms of rotor thickness is a big deal. If you do the basic math, 300 millimeters times 25 and 300 millimeters times 28, you see that the TSX front rotor actually has about 10 to 11% more overall size and capacity than the Civic Si rotors. And basically that pays huge dividends because rotors are heat sinks. Their goal is to absorb and then consequently dispel heat. And so the bigger that rotor is, the better it is at doing that job. Additionally, the TSX brake calipers are actually slightly larger than the Civic Si brake calipers, which again makes them better able to handle the heat of high performance driving. And bigger calipers and bigger rotors means bigger brake pads, which also means those larger TSX brake pads can handle more heat without disintegrating and falling apart quite as quickly as the stock Civic Si brakes, which are not good, even with a performance racing pad. So at this point, I've talked your ear off enough. You can see I have a couple boxes here to my left. Let's start unboxing stuff. First up, EBC brake pads. I want to start with a mild intermediate pad. So these are the EBC Yellow Stuff R's. I've used these in a couple different cars over the years and they've been rather successful. Not a full-on racing pad, but a pretty aggressive pad that can kind of handle some lapping without falling apart. Oh man, these things are heavy. Oh, okay. Next up are a set of StopTech slotted sport rotors. Now, obviously with rotors you can go as cheap as you want or as expensive as you want. I decided to go for a more expensive rotor just because I've had good experiences with StopTech rotors. I've also talked to a few track day people and they said that these, in particular these StopTech slotted rotors, can actually handle track abuse pretty well. Last but not least, another very heavy package is a set of TSX front brake calipers remanufactured by PowerStop. All these parts, as you can see, have been sourced from rockauto.com just because they have a great manner of choices and good prices. They also ship super fast. Oh yeah. Check that out. Oh wow, those are huge compared to the stock Civic Si road calipers. So PowerStop offers reman rotors through rockauto.com. You can see it's a used rotor, but it's in good shape, and they obviously put new seals and dust boots on it and then paint them red. Not the best paint job, but hey, it looks good enough for brake calipers. Check those bad boys out. Those are huge compared to the stock Civic Si calipers. And obviously there's another one right in there. And obviously new hardware, sliders, dust boots, bleeders, all that stuff. So that's very cool. Check this out. Slotted rotors by StopTech. Very nice. And some very yellow EBC yellow stuff pads. Oh yeah. Alright, I'm gonna stop, take some beauty shots, and then we're gonna get to this installation. Good evening, everyone. As you can see, it is now nighttime, though I have my best lighting behind the camera to try and make it look better. After filming the introduction, I forgot I had to go to work, which tends to get in the way of things quite often. But we're back, and as you see, the car's on jack stands, the wheels are removed, and we're gonna dive into this braking installation. But before we get started, I wanted to show you the difference. Well, as I go along, I'll try and show you the best of the differences to the best of my abilities. But I mentioned before that these TSX brake calipers are notably bigger than the stock SI components. And while I have everything kind of on here on the car, I wanted to kind of show you the difference. So, stock SI brakes, as you can see, these rotors are kind of shot. And this is the TSX caliper. I'm at the right side and everything. Alright, so SI brakes. I painted them black a while back, in case you're curious why these ones are black. But SI brakes. Oh man, these are heavy. TSX brakes. You can see that the bridge is bigger, the caliper body is bigger, the piston is much larger, which could be an issue with pedal travel, but we'll get to that issue when we're there. But as you can see, just a much larger unit. I'm gonna try to hold that up. You see that? Big difference. And once I get these rotors off there, I'll give you a comparison of those two, as well as the brake pads. But now you kind of see like what we're working with here in terms of upgrades. Let's jump into the removal and installation. All right, so as far as tools you're gonna need to do this job, it's pretty straightforward. You're gonna need a ratchet, a 12, a 14, 17 mil socket, and if your rotors are untouched, you're gonna need an impact driver because they have these two impact screws right here that are a real pain in the butt, and they will absolutely strip out a Phillips head screwdriver. So get impact drivers for these guys if you have them, and beyond that, this should be all you need. Also, I'm not sure if you can see it on the camera, we actually have the energy suspension box right here. That's just to put the caliper aside. You don't want to let the caliper dangle once you kind of remove it, otherwise it could damage your brake line. There is one specialty tool I'm going to need a few steps after this, but we'll get to that when we get to that. So let's start taking stuff apart. Alright, with a 12 mil socket, we're going to remove the brake line fastener on the strut assembly just to give our brake lines more slack. Okay, and then we have the two brake caliper to knuckle bolts. Those are 17 mil, one up here, one down there. Again, take your ratchet and get to it.
If your car is all original, has been assembled for a long time, not been disassembled, this might be really tough and you can just use a breaker bar and get it off, but these shouldn't be that bad since I rebuilt these calipers about a year ago. Oh, there we go. All right, so the knuckle bolts are out and now our caliper is free to be moved around. There we go. And that's where that box comes in handy, like I mentioned. Basically, I'm gonna use this box to just set the caliper aside so I can kind of plan my attack here. This is the point in the game where if you have rotor set screws here and here, you'd knock those out, but I do not. So my rotors just pop right off. Like that. And now I'm going to show you TSX rotors versus SI rotors. Let's cut to that. All right, I am back with the stock SI rotor and the TSX spec StopTech slotted front rotors. It's worth noting that rotors in this case are directional. StopTech provides a left and a right sticker on the rotors to make sure you don't get them mixed up. But beyond that, let's look at the differences. Oof. While both are heavy, the TSX rotor is notably heavier. These rotors only have about 5,000 miles and a couple track days on them, so they're not that used, but there's a pretty notable weight difference, and I'm not sure if the camera's catching that, but the big difference is obviously in the thickness of the rotor. That center section there, these vanes are 3 millimeters thicker, which means they can just handle a lot more heat and expel a lot more heat out of the rotors. Additionally, these are obviously slotted rotors. I'm not sure that actually helps, but I've heard on the paddock it does seem to help. A little bit worse on pad wear, a little bit easier on the rotors, but that's just conjecture. But yes, this is the big difference you're looking at. Obviously, diameter is the same, both 300 millimeters, but that thickness, that is crucial, and that's what gives us that about 11% more overall volume and area at this TSX rotor. Also a good time to take a look at the differences in the brake pads. So this is a stock Civic Si brake pad. Sorry it's not totally in focus. And this is a TSX brake pad. Okay, so this is the messiest and probably the hardest part of the install, so it's the one you guys probably need to see the most to see a better understanding of how it all works. So first off, make sure you have the correct brake caliper for your side of the car. Brake calipers are directional, bleeder faces upwards. Now we're gonna swap the calipers, which means unhooking the brake line from the brake caliper. Now all this takes is a 14 mil socket, so it's certainly not hard, but it can be very messy, just because when you unhook that brake line, it's basically gonna gush brake fluid everywhere, and that's an absolute mess. And so a quick tip to make this at least a little bit less messy is to actually have an assistant, if you have one, put their foot on the brake pedal and hold the brake pedal down. That basically stops or at least stems the flow of brake fluid to the calipers. Unfortunately, I do not have a helper here, so I've actually enlisted the help of the other StopTech rotor. I basically just put the rotor on the brake pedal and held it down to the best of my ability. Obviously it's not gonna work perfectly in this case, but it's better than nothing. I've also used a brick before. People have used broomsticks. You can kind of get creative with it. But yeah, this is gonna be the fun step. Make sure we kind of got this ready to go. And with any reman calipers, new calipers, you wanna make sure you get these two little washers with them. Basically, this brake line uses what's called a banjo bolt, which is a bolt with holes in it to let the fluid flow through. And as you tighten that bolt down, you wanna have one washer on either side of that bolt, just so there's no leaks. This is basically similar to using a washer on your oil pan bolt when you change your oil. Same principle, but there's two of them, one for each side of the banjo bolt. So make sure you got those, and let's just jump into it. It's gonna be a mess. Obviously this goes without saying, but make sure everything you don't want to get brake fluid on is kind of out of the way here. There we go. Hey, there we go. My holding down the brake pedal trick seems to have worked. We're not like really getting much in the way of flow out of here, though there's obviously fluid inside the caliper, so don't tip that over. We're just gonna set that aside. We're gonna grab our new washers. You can reuse the banjo bolt, that's a-okay. Put one washer on the caliper side. Grab your banjo, line up your brake line. Okay, there we go. Wash on the other side of the banjo bolt through the brake line, and then let's bolt this sucker down. Look at that, no mess, no fuss. The only brake fluid is, you can see about that little amount on my fingers. And that's all we got. And now, excuse me, we're gonna set this caliper aside and then get everything else ready. Oh man, sorry I had to cut the camera there. I realized that anyone who says you can just bend the dust shield out of the way has no idea what they're talking about. You definitely have to cut the dust shield up to make these larger calipers fit. That was a lot of trial and error. I basically ended up using a Dremel and then some tin snips and basically cut the ears off the dust shield, and that gave me enough clearance to bolt this all up. Whew! Man, that was a lot of work. All right, so new rotor installed, new pads and calipers installed. All I need to do is rehook this brake line back to the strut and then bleed the brakes. We'll do the other side. Then bleed the brakes, then we're done. Trying to do gravity bleeding for the first time since no one's around to help me with the brake fluid right now, so I can at least get some sort of brake pedal in the car. If you're not familiar, gravity bleeding supposedly is the most natural old school way to bleed your brakes, where you basically pump pedal up, pop the cap off the reservoir, open up the bleeder, don't touch it, and just wait for fluid to come out. I read about this online. I see people talk about it all the time. It's never quite worked for me, but trying it now because no one else is around, so I may as well give it a shot. They said online to have the brake, your catch pan line, so I basically have some 3/8 inch tubing going into a catch can with the hose completely submerged. Basically said to have this hose kind of arcing up, so because air bubbles, trapped air goes up, and you can see, maybe you can't see, little tiny air bubbles are coming out along with brake fluid. So hopefully we'll have a brake pedal back in the car soon. Hello everyone, on the road after doing some gravity bleeding and a quick drive around the block to bed in these pads. And I just want to give you a quick update on the TSX braking situation. I mentioned before that because the piston in the brake calipers is slightly larger than the standard Civic Si brakes, in theory this should change the feel of the brake pedal on this car versus standard. And indeed there does seem to be a small difference, but it's not massive. It is absolutely drivable as is. Took bleeding the calipers a couple times, really a decent pedal. And then obviously bedding in new pads and rotors, and now everything seems okay. I've read online that some people still upgrade to the Acura TLS master cylinder just for even better brake feel. And that's something I think I might consider in the future. But for now, the TSX brakes are absolutely usable as is. I have a track day coming up soon. Very excited to get these things on track and tested. So driving around with the TSX brake upgrade, so yes, the pedal is slightly longer, a little bit softer initially until everything kind of bites down, and then the pedal feels nice and solid and hard. It takes some getting used to, but it actually does feel more linear than the standard braking setup, and the fact that if you give it a little bit of brake pedal, you get a little bit of brakes, and the more you lay into the pedal, the more brake you get. So it takes a bit of recalibration more than anything for yourself. But as far as the brake feel, it actually feels slightly more natural now because it feels more like a linear input of what you're putting into the brakes versus what you're getting. So thank you very much for watching this episode of Project Honda Civic Si, and I will see you in the next episode, hopefully back at the racetrack. Bye.